Thank you all so much for being here and for joining us in this discussion. I'm excited to learn a little bit along with you. Sabrina, if you could start us off just by telling us a little bit about your research, what led you to that research, and just kind of some background.
Sure. I think I'd be the last person that you would peg growing up that would become an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I grew up in a smaller Texas town that was very homogenous in a lot of ways. And it wasn't until I was maybe 10 years old where I saw some of my close relatives struggle with bringing their personal identities into the workplace, whether it was chronic illnesses or maybe mental health struggles, and trying to figure out in a small Texas town in the 80s how to bring those issues up at work was not really a norm back then for those worlds to kind of collide, your personal life and your work life. And it was through really seeing some of my close family members go through those conversations. How do I talk to my workplace about a chronic illness I have, especially when that's a hidden identity and I would have to disclose for them to know. But it's serious enough that I would like to inform them of that. And so, kind of seeing the world through a different lens rather than that homogenous standard, what we think is standard sometimes when we have very privileged identities. Seeing someone navigate the world in those ways with that sort of lens led me down a path of wanting to explore more and more kind of the experiences and the lived experiences of individuals in the workforce that are outside of what some might term normal or average, um, which we all know we're all unique and that those terms are kind of maybe not appropriate, but we used to use them a lot, at least in Texas in the 80s. So my apologies, but that's really what brought me to this work, and I do it to this day.
It's great to hear that it was personal experience that really just kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
affected that and impacted some of your research. So it seems like people are bringing their identities into the workplace a lot more than they used to a decade ago, whether it was their culture or just certain affinities or, a variety of things. And so I'm wondering why you think that is and what some of your research has found about how that helps employees or employers.
Oh, well, I certainly do think that's the case. I feel as the world changes, and I'll be specific by what I mean with that, but as the world changes, it is more of a norm or more acceptable or just the way it is that our work lives and our outside of work lives kind of merge more and more. So I think the classic example that we're all familiar with from a very recent kind of episode is the COVID pandemic. And when all of a sudden we're at home and we're turning on Zoom, I know that wasn't applicable to essential workers and everybody in the workforce, but a lot of us were thrust into this environment where we were turning on Zoom, and all of a sudden, all of my colleagues see my children running around and behind me, and my cat, like jumping up and kind of personally get invited into my personal kind of life domain that is usually outside of work, and if I chose not to share that or that was important to me to kind of segment those two, all of a sudden that wasn't really an option anymore, especially those first few weeks where we didn't know how to blur the background and all those fun features that we're experts at now. And that's another reality, just how technology has changed. Is just another reality that really can blend work and life spheres more and more and integrate those such that when people are in the workplace, we're realizing more and more that they're humans with lives, not just maybe factory workers or robots, where sometimes when you don't have that life view of your employees, you can see people that way in your workplace. And also, another change in society and in our workplaces is that there just simply is more representation at higher levels. So, individuals whose life experiences may not have been as um, integrated into conversations amongst leaders, especially top leaders who are making policies and procedures. I won't say the progress has been as much as I would like to see. You could use a number of examples but to have a practical example for us to go off of, let's say the proportion of female leaders in like top CEO suite type jobs that has grown. There was a little kind of lapse in 2020 with the recession affecting women more than men. But as people with traditionally marginalized identities get into positions where they have power and can control policies and procedures, we see that the lived experience that hasn't traditionally maybe been a part of those policies and procedures, such as maternity leave in this case, in this example, or maybe bereavement policies around pregnancy loss. These are just a few examples we can think of. All of the sudden, that sphere of life is being brought into the workplace more and more because those individuals have seat at the table, so to speak, where their voice can be heard more easily, and that can impact policies and procedures.
So employers really had to change the way that they did things because employees were bringing their identities and more of these issues into the
And
workplace.
society's just at that place,
Yeah.
whether technology is allowing it, whether circumstances like COVID are just we have to
Hmm.
we have to be there. Um, And I realize now that some organizations are kind of trying to backpedal and institute, maybe less flexible
Hmm.
work arrangements and things like that. But we could talk about that if you want.
Sounds
I
good.
won't monopolize our time.
Well, I mean, that's a great point, and yeah, we can definitely delve into it. Do you see employers reversing a lot of those
Mhm.
policies that they had implemented during the pandemic, and how is that affecting their work and their employees' work?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we do see that, and I feel like it has a direct impact, particularly for marginalized populations. We saw that flexible work policies, whether that's hybrid work or fully remote work, really gave access to individuals with disabilities, for example. One of the lowest rates of kind of accessible work, people who want to work and but there's a lot of barriers in how we create workspaces or to where they're not accessible. And so when it was a reality and we had to face that as employers, how do we set up these flexible work policies? Because we're not going into the office. We were really able to see that women with a lot of caregiving demands, whether that's childcare, elder care, or both of those, had more flexible options to really attend to all of those spheres of their lives and where they were needed in their family. We also saw individuals with disability had access in ways that um, we could actually see growth and progress in their hiring rates within that community that we hadn't seen before. We also, I think some of the most interesting research around this is, you know, people saying, you got to get back into the office. Another thing you're not considering, in addition to these accessibility concerns and what flexibility can do, especially for the caregivers in our society. Um, we saw a lot of reports and research on individuals who experience a lot of microaggressions and, also overt racism and, more overt in the kind of workplace issues as well. All of a sudden, they're reporting that when they're at home and on Zoom, that's a different interaction with their colleagues and their employers, where some of that is now removed from the workplace. Because you're not having those water cooler conversations or those side conversations in the break room where jokes are made here. Sometimes there's not a space for that in a Zoom environment. And so I thought that research was really interesting and something we need to think about. And by really rolling back those flexible work policies, we're really damaging kind of the flexibility, accessibility, and just day to day experiences for a number of marginalized groups that this could really make a difference keeping things flexible. So I think employers need to think more about that before a top CEO is like, I liked it the way it was
Right.
before. Well, let's think of some other some other
Hmm.
considerations and how the lived kind of experience of your employees might have actually gotten better in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
So something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of along those lines, I mean, employers have faced a lot of public pressure to either take stances on certain issues, um,
Ooh.
or they have taken stances and have faced backlash, and so they were trying to kind of figure out what do we do next. Where do you see that trend, and do you are there any like specific examples that you can think of that really show that?
Sure. There's a lot actually, and my recent memory is going to kind of bias my answer. So, if I'm forgetting any major things that have been interrupted or kind of that were prominent in your workplace, forgive me. But I'll just give a few examples
Mhm.
of. Um, I think the first time I really got a sense as a researcher of organizations really being asked to take a stance on something was actually, I believe it was 2017, where in North Carolina, there were white supremacists. Okay, you are all familiar. And it was the first time that Fortune 500 organizations were taking a stance and saying no, or around bathroom bills and where HR and kind of public stand, all of this. That was the first time I remember. There might have
Mhm.
been previous kind of ways that organizations did that. And that really was something that caused conversation, but I don't think it was really a norm until maybe 2020 around Black Lives Matter and protests and really the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other prominent kind of murders that and because COVID was happening and we were all just kind of at home watching
Mhm.
videos or being able to engage in these conversations in ways that maybe some of us had not before, it all of a sudden became a norm that we expected our organizations to take stances on social justice events. There had been kind of norms around maybe environmental type
Mhm.
conversations where I'm just saying that because we're close to Boulder and sustainability and all in Texas that those weren't words we talked about a lot in the 80s. But in Texas we didn't even have recycling bins in the 80s, and now I like 6 years ago I moved to Boulder and we have the recycling bins where there's 9 different cubbies for like the different types of plastic. That was an embarrassing day when I had to ask a lot of questions about that. I'm getting better. But around social justice and racial justice topics, especially, we're really seeing that. And I think it started to become a norm that stakeholders, internal employees, consumers, like what products do I want to buy from what companies? Where do I want to put my money? All of a sudden, these values of organizations became very relevant to stakeholders for a number of reasons. Where do I want to work? Where do I want to put my money? And so in 2020, that certainly wasn't the first time we saw organizations making statements, but I think they really sat differently because we were at home and they were. Um, hitting our emails. They weren't just a team leader saying this or that, or a CEO maybe saying something on the news in 2017. These hit in very personal ways. And now what we see is even this week, if we want to talk about okay, you're all you're all with me here. We're getting at least my organization, we're getting those emails again, and we've got
Asking you to take a stance on Palestine, Israel.
exactly, exactly. And so I don't think this is going away. I think this is intensifying as a norm where we're asking our organizations to take a stance on social justice issues in a real way so us as stakeholders can determine if we want to work and shop, et cetera, invest in different companies. And did you say something about backlash?
Yeah,
I
oh
apologize.
no, that's okay. So some companies have received backlash for certain stances,
Sure.
and I'm just curious if you think they're going to be less or more hesitant to take public stances as time goes on.
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen that with, I think they call it the Bud Light controversy, and Target was
Mhm.
kind of a part of that as well. Even I think a Major League Baseball team, and so we've seen organizations waver
Mm.
and not have the resources to know how to make these statements. And I think maybe even some hesitancy to make a statement because I haven't been trained to do this. What do I say? What if I say the wrong thing? And so is it better just to say nothing or say something that, even though I've worked with my marketing team on this, we might not feel like we have all the facts, or this isn't really our space, so we don't feel secure in it, versus maybe this is a really great statement and I have more resources around the marketing team, so I know this is going to go over really well with my stakeholders. Um, that's a really hard place. I'm actually in the middle of some research right now that shows making a statement, no matter what level of social justice, um, kind of where you rank on a scale of how successful that is better than not making a statement. And so that's very impactful, I think, when that comes out for organizations to realize. And another thing is that when there are prominent theories in our field, sorry, I won't put anyone to sleep. I know it's the end of the day, but show that when there's mixed messaging or inconsistent signals, like Bud Light or Target, where it's like you say one thing and then you kind of
Backtrack.
yeah, that backlash. There's a reason that consumers and stakeholders respond that way. You're just going to lose the trust in so many ways, and so many prominent theories in our field show that is the last thing you want to do. It there's just so much research that shows that for employees, there's that loss of trust, and um, y- you're never going to make everybody happy,
Mhm.
especially with these types of value statements that are now um, a lot of times connected with the social justice movements or these controversies. So, knowing who you are as a company and being able to stay firm with that is the most important, I think, through these statements and what we're seeing in research. And not only the newest research, what is supported through theories that have guided our field for decades, almost centuries at this point. So I think it's pretty clear that being wishy washy is the worst thing, not saying something or ignoring it, not engaging in the conversation has pretty negative outcomes as well. But it also highlights for us as HR practitioners, as employers, that this is a new management competency that is going to be expected from us. And it's not going away. It's a norm now. And we've seen that over the last 5 years, especially. So,
So one thing I wanted to talk to you about that we previously had discussion on is the U.S. has an epidemic of obesity as well as chronic diseases associated with it, including diabetes, high blood pressure.
yeah.
As a result, more companies have workers with chronic diseases.
Mm.
Are they doing enough to support them? Are wellness programs effective?
Ooh. That's a really kind of hot topic of conversation right now. I actually learned something just the other day, and this is just my own ignorance, but I didn't realize things like cancer actually do turn into chronic illnesses, and it's the maintenance of kind of it's not over once the chemo's over or whatnot. There's a lot of maintenance and things. So I'm learning about new chronic illnesses every day. Also, as a professor, you'd be surprised how many individuals in my classes are coming to me and saying, I need accommodations for this or that. And just a lot of research and kind of like openness on your part as a manager or a professor to learn about so many different chronic illnesses that you might your employees might be faced with and might end up as part of your management or leadership strategy that you might not have known about before. So I've certainly been in that situation. I feel like every day I'm learning more and more about chronic illnesses, even though if you remember back to 20 minutes ago, that's why I started this in this field in the first place, is kind of close family members navigating chronic illnesses and how to bring that into the workplace when and if they chose to. And so that's a really interesting conversation that as we're bringing more and more of our personal lives into the workplace, as our definition of society of stigma can kind of change around different identities, as we realize more that certain identities, if there's a lot that goes into stigma, whether someone is at fault or not, or perceived that way. There's just such a complicated kind of theoretical discussion around how stigma develops and is perceived. But to move past kind of maybe getting into the more practical point of that, I really think it's about the employer's willingness to be open and accommodating. And as HR professionals, just realizing how many of our systems are really steeped in able-bodiedness in a lot of ways. I had a student tell me, this was just a year or two ago, that they were asked if they had reliable transportation during an interview, and they didn't know how to answer that as someone with epilepsy. They're like, I take Ubers and Lyfts everywhere, but is that what the HR professional means by reliable transportation? Like, I can't drive. If you have a seizure, there's a lot of laws around, usually around 6 months. You're not having a license that's valid. And I'm not going to get into legal things. That's not my expertise. I don't want to give bad legal advice, but there's a lot around different chronic illnesses that none of us are going to be fully equipped to discuss in our lifetime. But the openness to consider our policies and procedures, even interview questions around, do you have reliable transportation? As we're getting into kind of today's day and age where some companies even have AI asking, interview questions and first rounds of screening. If there's not a place and a time and a space for individuals with chronic illness to kind of ask questions back, like, what do you mean by reliable transportation? Or describing how, they do make use of maybe Uber, Lyft, something like that, and they've never been late in their life or something like that. If there's not that space to kind of interact and understand what that lived experience is, and that's going to differ for every type of chronic illness and even the severity of the chronic illness across your employees, I think it's really important that we just have that flexibility around our policies and procedures to be able to kind of, interact with our employees in that way.
Well, I know we are out of time, so just really quickly, last question. What are your predictions for the workplace for 2024 or even in the next 5 years?
It's a cool question. Um, I will answer it with a zero flashing in the clock. Like that puts a lot of pressure on it. I will say a lot of my work and a lot of conversations that I've heard, maybe even that you've heard today, do center around the idea of neurodiversity and how to expand our HR policies and practices around those who are neurodiverse. How talk about really a conversation about how stigma is changing, how definitions are changing, and how we can continue to think about flexible workplace practices or just our workplace practices in general, and kind of being able to maybe learn something and adapt and grow from what we saw happen in the pandemic. How can we continue to make our workplaces more and more flexible so that we can be more and more accommodating, inclusive, all of those words, whether we're talking about people with disabilities, which could overlap or be distinct to people that identify as neurodiverse, which could be distinct or overlapping as people with chronic illnesses. I'm trying to tie in 10 answers to 10 different questions with the clock flashing at me, but we're just gonna say that was that was an acceptable way to do that with that ending.
It was. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing, and I learned a lot, so thank you.
Thank you.